Howdy, everybody. Welcome back to the Kentuckian. I'm glad that you've decided to join us for another episode. If this is your first time, welcome to the Kentuckian. I hope that we have something that you will enjoy. But the first question that I have, and sort of the opening premise for this episode, is I'm wondering, have you ever considered or thought about the disease infecting the government? Have you ever considered the government itself as a disease? Now, if you answered yes to that second question, you might be a libertarian. All jokes aside, the disease of the government, and I do want to make clear, I've said this before on other episodes of the Kentuckian, government in and of itself is not evil. And I have also, by the way, addressed the libertarian thing. If you'd like to check that out, that was an old Spotify episode. But government in and of itself is not evil. It does have a purpose, but it always turns to evil if it survives long enough. There's a disease that infects it. Evil infects government over time. And this disease, this cancer, in our specific case, infects every part of the government. And that's what I want to consider for a few moments today. Let's really think about the problems in the government with open eyes, hopefully honest hearts, right? And do our best to understand the broken and diseased state of our current government. And I've mentioned before, this is new. One thing you'll probably notice on the other episodes, I think I've done on the others, I move a lot here. I'm going to try not to do that. So maybe if I'm doing it still, you can comment down below and let me know to remind me to make sure that I'm not doing that. So the first point, or the first area where I want to talk about the corruption in the government, is corruption is thoroughly entrenched in the original government. It's probably the most obvious corruption in the government is the original government, the judiciary, legislative, and executive branches, kind of the big three that were originally in the Constitution when the Constitution was ratified. But before we go, and I'm going to talk about each arm of the government, but I want to talk for a moment about parties and the political party system that we have in this country and we have had since very, very early on in our history. The party system is a total mess, and I'd say most people probably recognize this to one degree or another. This is one thing that actually most people on either side of the political aisle will agree on, that the party system is very broken. And the party system has become a way to consolidate power and control the current political narrative and the political theater that's a fundamental part of all government operations in the United States government, federal government, and mostly in the state government as well. State governments, excuse me. The parties play a significant role throughout all of this episode, and when it comes to understanding the practical elements of this disease that's infected the government, this corruption, this rot, whatever you want to call it. In some ways, the political parties also some of the main sources of these problems as well. See, what we need to understand, and I have mentioned this before in the Kentuckian as well, but repetition is important. I can say it in a different way, and sometimes just hearing it again and hearing it again, eventually you remember it. But the party system has encouraged two separate things. One, the party system has helped encourage the career politician problem that we have. People can actually go and make a living being a politician. Now, that isn't the only thing that has led to career politicians, but it is a part of it. That establishment, the organization, and the funding that comes through political parties once they become organized and powerful enough. And so now you have people that are elected not to serve their constituents, but elected to be elected. That's their job, right? They're elected to be a politician, to work in government. And that's a big problem, huge problems with that. And this second point is connected with that, and there are other implications as well. The other thing that the party system encourages is a change in attitude among people that are elected. The general attitude no longer is, I want what's best for my constituents, my state, and my country, right? That idea of public service. I'm doing this because my constituents or my neighbors, or the people that I'm around want me to run, or I know I can do good for them, and so I want to run to serve my community, serve my country, right? And it changes the attitude to, I want what's best for my political party, and I want what's best for advancing my political ambitions. That goes to that career politician thing, right? It's your job. You want to excel at it. You want to increase your power and your influence and your money, instead of I'm doing this because I want to serve my neighbors, because I want to further the cause of freedom, because I want to serve my country. And that's a completely different change in attitude, a completely different attitude, And that completely different attitude, guess what? Leads to completely different actions. It leads to hollowness. It leads to political theater. It leads to saying one thing, doing another. What a late historian friend of mine called SMS, or split mouth syndrome, right? Saying one thing out of one side of his mouth and one thing out of the other. And that's been a huge problem. That's led to a lot of the problems that we've had in this country today. So after that little bit longer mention of parties than I meant it to be, let's go and talk about the other branches of government. And I didn't mean to say other as in the party system being a branch of government, but effectively it is at this point. So there you go. Take that for what you will. The corruption in the legislature, which is the first branch I was going to talk about, in Congress, basically, the House of Representatives and the Senate, is mind-boggling. And I could probably do there's no question. I could do a series, probably multiple series, on the corruption and the just the gall of politicians in Congress. It's ridiculous. I keep up with news a little differently than some people do, but I see the actions of congressmen in committees and on the floor and stuff fairly frequently, and it's appalling, absolutely appalling. In fact, if you go to the Instagram page, I haven't shared it yet, but soon, within the next day or two of this coming out, not of this coming out, if you check back on the Instagram page, I'll try and make a post of it. I'm going to try and at least share it on the Reels, of a clip of Maxine Waters as the head of some subcommittee. And it's just appalling. She doesn't care about her job. She's ignoring parliamentary procedure because she doesn't want to deal with a Republican. It's gross. It's ridiculous. So check up on that on the Instagram page. Like I said, I'll try and make a post out of it, but if I can't, I'll probably put it on my story at least a couple times if possible. Anyway, these politicians in Congress, it's just ridiculous, right? Hopefully you'll be able to see that example soon if you haven't already. But, these people, they sleep through the job. They'll literally be in session in Congress, and these old people are just sitting there asleep. They don't care. Nobody's waking them up. They may not even vote, right? They lie with impunity, whether that's to each other, whether that's to subcommittees, whether that's to their constituents. They ignore or twist the words of testimony right in front of the people who gave the testimony. We've seen that a lot with some of the stuff with the recent disease that's gone around, and we've seen that with some of the January 6th stuff, and almost any time there's any kind of testimony before Congress, they just twist it. They either ignore what's said, they make stuff up, they make implications that there can be no logical way that implication could be made. All the time. They don't care. They're just trying to get the right sound bites for the camera, right? They're trying to make sure that they can have something to put in their campaign ads that are going to get their voter base hopefully fired up enough, and I use that term loosely, hopefully motivated enough to actually get out and vote for them. These people, they go to the same bars and the same parties and who knows what else, after basically attacking each other, Republicans and Democrats going after each other on the floor of Congress, and then immediately after they go and they live it up and they have a big old time and they don't care because they're all part of the same establishment. They're all part of the same power structure. Yeah, the Republicans in general are the opposition party, but they aren't really all that different from the Democrats, and we see that especially when it comes to what they vote on. And they'll vote on a few things here or there to keep people from getting too mad. They'll give them a few things, but they never fight. Whenever they have the power to do something, they never make good use of it. Mitch McConnell's a great example of that. He'll talk a big talk, and he'll be all this opposition person when there's a Democrat that's in the president's office. But then as soon as somebody like Trump gets elected, he won't work with him one bit. And nothing gets done. Because they're not about getting stuff done. That's Congress, right? It's about maintaining your power. It's about building up a career. You'll be in Congress for 20, 30, 40 years and never do anything in some cases. And then you retire, and you've always voted just like the party whip told you to. And just so you know, the party whip is the Republicans and the Democrats both have one. Basically just a guy, he's kind of like the ramrod of the operation. He tells you, hey, you need to vote this way, or you shouldn't vote on this, that kind of thing. That's a position in the parties in Congress. So they always voted just like the party whip told them to, whether they're Democrats or Republicans. They retire, and then they get a cushy lobbyist job and make more than most people can imagine making in their entire lifetime for doing nothing. And they've got, of course, inside connections because they were in Congress, and they've probably got secrets they're selling and other stuff. That's allegedly, right? I don't want YouTube or somebody to shut me down for something because I said it and I didn't say that it was alleged or didn't substantiate it enough, because they do things like that. So just so you know, allegedly. And that's some of the most obvious stuff, right? That's the stuff we all see that's just sort of par for the course, right? That's what everybody does, and that's what we as Americans see, with very little exception in Congress. And it's pathetic. It's absolutely pathetic, and it's disgusting, and we should be disgusted by it too. Even Republicans are especially bad about saying tough stuff for the camera and then doing nothing about it. Or, in many cases, even opposite of what they had promised to do. Very common. So what about the judiciary system? Well, the judiciary system's a joke. There's no rule of law. It's rule of whim. It's rule of party. It's rule of what you want, basically. Supreme Court justices can borderline write law at times with impunity. Now, to be fair, at this time, the justices that we have in the Supreme Court are pretty solid. They're not perfect, but there have been some really good rulings, some very, very smart rulings when it comes to upholding the Constitution. So that's great. But, when that changes, and that's definitely not been the norm, but when that changes, it's, Wild West out there. Who knows what's going to happen? Whatever's the most politically expedient is what happens. Not what's right. Not what does the law say. It's, well, what should I say because of social justice? What should I say because of my donors? What should I say because of the guy that's got blackmail on me, allegedly? And that goes to the way that justices are picked. And remember, too, in case you're not very familiar, it's not just the Supreme Court. You're also talking about all the circuit courts as well. I believe is it 11? I don't remember. But the federal courts that aren't just Supreme Court. There's several of those as well, and those justices are generally picked by the president, or well, I guess actually usually the president, maybe somebody else occasionally, but they're never picked on, are they going to make, or I'm not going to say never, most of the time, maybe with very rare exception when somebody like Trump comes along, they're going to be picked on whether or not they toe the party line. They're going to be picked on whether or not they've got the right connections, or whatever the case might be. Not, is this person going to make a decision that is lawful? Is this person going to make a decision, an interpretation of law that is truthful and that's accurate? That's not, for most politicians, that's not even a consideration. In fact, they will often, at least when it comes to the Supreme Court, they will often oppose people that clearly seem to indicate that that's how they would rule, that they are not interested in party politics, at least what they claim. They just want to do what the law says, and generally their legal record will kind of go along with that. And oftentimes those people will be actively opposed. It's absolutely ridiculous, and it shows just how much of a joke the judiciary system is now. Now, that doesn't mean they're not dangerous, but compared to what they're supposed to be, it's awful. And that's not to mention that the Justice Department is often also used as a political witch hunt tool to go after people and organizations that the current person in power doesn't like. Or sometimes they'll be used as a way to keep states in line, threatening lawsuits, threatening sanctions, and those sorts of things. If a state passes a certain piece of legislation or enforces certain legislation, you don't hear about that much, but it does happen. And if you pay attention to the right sources, you hear about it happening some. Just so you know, for frame of reference, I first remember hearing about that, if you ever listened to Rush Limbaugh, when Obama was in office. That was a big problem. He was using the Justice Department like that quite a bit. To help control states and stuff, and Rush Limbaugh talked about it quite a bit. That's where I first kind of heard about it. So that maybe triggers a memory for you. Maybe you heard about something of that nature as well. I hope it does. And that brings us to the executive branch. Now, that includes the office of the president. I'm only going to talk about the president and the army, because we're going to talk about some of the other parts of the executive in a moment. The military is a woke experimentation test bed, and I actually do keep, not as closely as some people, but I do keep a fairly close tabs on what's going on in the military when it comes to policy, when it comes to those sorts of things. And the military is just, it's being hollowed out. There's a lot of things going on. I don't want to get too far off into it right now for sake of time, and that's not the focus of this episode, to get into too many specifics. But the military is being hollowed out. It's been kind of a woke test bed for a while to try out these crazy social justice measures that have been going on, but it's gotten way worse recently, and there seems to be an active effort. It seems to be an active effort to scare off people that are not of a more left-leaning political persuasion. Of course, there's stuff with the shots, if you get my meaning. I have to be careful what I call them, again, for the purposes of YouTube. But, the shots for the recent virus, those sorts of things. There's a lot of things that's just one example, a lot of things that maybe indicate or seeming to indicate a very strong effort to push certain kinds of people out of the military. And of course, the president is basically just a figurehead most of the time. I think we probably understand that. If you want to be frank, it's one of the reasons Trump was so popular, because for all his faults, he wasn't that kind of person. He didn't have the money connections that Republicans have, right? Republicans have to have think tanks and super PACs and all these people fund them. Maybe not think tanks, but they usually have to get approval of think tanks and get the right funding, because they can't afford to run a presidential campaign on their own. But Trump could. So he didn't have those money connections where it's like, well, I gave you money for this campaign and now you're elected. Why don't you do something for me? Trump just didn't have that. Whatever you think of him, and again, I'm not saying he's perfect for all his faults, that was a definite advantage. And it's the same thing with the president. The president's basically controlled by staffers and people that are in the bureaucracy. It's been that way for a long time. The former Vice President Joe Biden definitely has a worse case of that, because, he can't form sentences most of the time and doesn't seem to be able to take care of himself anymore and should be in a nursing home. But regardless, it's just perhaps more obvious just how bad it is in that case. So then that brings me to the bureaucracy. And I think this corruption, while it might not be quite as obvious at times, is perhaps nowhere better illustrated than in the bureaucracy. As I have said, and will continue to say on the Kentuckian, the absolutely ludicrous overregulation of the government is choking progress, it's choking economic growth, and it's choking the average American like you. It's like some slimy, terrible python with poison dripping at its fangs, strangling the life out of America and out of Americans. It's awful. And I'm just going to go through a few brief examples. One of them's the IRS. Well, the IRS, as you probably have heard, most people have, they're trying to hire 87,000 new agents for some odd reason. Oh, and they also, right when they got the funding for that, posted job listings for the IRS requiring a willingness to use lethal force. And we all know it's to try and go after the individual, right? They've tried to pass some rules. I'm not sure exactly where they stand right now, but tried to pass some rules where they were going to go after people if they had gotten like $600 in Venmo or something like that. Those sorts of things where if you reached a very small threshold, you could potentially be audited, or they might come after you if you didn't report it. Those kind of things, right? They're not going after the really rich people. They're going after people like you and me. We can list 100 other bureaucratic organizations that bully and intimidate and manipulate and otherwise hold down and control both businesses and individuals with asinine and often ridiculous and ineffective regulations. Most of the time, ridiculous and ineffective regulations. Another example, you think about like the CIA and the FBI. The CIA, aside from providing corrupt intelligence when it's politically convenient and fits various political goals, has had a long history of shady behavior. We've talked about some of it before. They've overthrown and installed puppet governments for years. The FBI has become another intimidation wing of the government, raiding political rivals, producing false reports, and wasting time and diverting attention. Not spending much time on that, but do note that a lot of what they do is diverting attention from more important things with phony and highly publicized investigations, and you can probably think of one or two if you keep up with politics at all. Another good example would be OSHA, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration. If you work in a factory, if you work on a construction site, if you work in a mine, if you do that kind of labor, you're probably very familiar with OSHA to one degree or another. OSHA. OSHA is a backwards plague doctor walking to and fro, ignoring most problems out there that they're supposed to be fixing, but then going after companies that get caught. And then they provide contradictory, burdensome, and impossible to follow rules in general in their OSHA handbook and such. And then they dole out cures to workplace safety concerns that are usually worse than the problem was in the first place. OSHA is a mess, and anybody that's had to work with them any extent at all knows what I'm talking about, and probably knows even better than me. I have limited work with them, or limited in my job and other experience. I have limited interaction with them or their cures, if you will, their regulations and their inspections and those sorts of things. But it's just ridiculous, and we can talk about that more later on. I had an episode where I talked about some of that a little more specifically. I believe it was called The Federal Serpent Strangling Progress. That was a Spotify episode only, if you'd like to check that out. But all this to say, and hopefully you see, yeah, man, this is stuff, it's bad stuff. Maybe a lot of you all already know about it, right? It's just sort of a reminder. But also, like, well, okay, these things are a problem, but how bad is it really, right? How is this cancer, is it really that in-depth? Can it be cut off or treated, or is it so ingrained in the structure that it's basically a lost cause? Well, there's a lot more messed up stuff we could talk about, and I'm sure, Lord willing, we will in the future talk about more of it. But I wanted to talk about a few things that didn't fall into specific bureaucratic organizations or specific chambers of the House to help illustrate that this is a disease. The disease, the corruption, the rot that is in the government is so thoroughly ingrained into every part of the government that the government in its current form is unsalvageable. Things like, do you remember Operation Northwoods? I did an episode talking about it a few episodes back. Maybe you've forgotten, or maybe you haven't heard about it. Operation Northwoods was a operation that the Department of Defense signed off on and tried to get John F. Kennedy to sign off on. I believe it was 1962, if I remember correctly. And basically, it was a plan to coordinate attacks on American citizens and American military interests, both in the United States and, if I remember correctly, close to Cuba. And there were a lot of strategies to make it look like it was the Cubans that had done these attacks, and it was Americans, I think it was the CIA, doing these attacks on other Americans on American home soil, making it look like it was the Cubans so they could justify a war with Cuba to capture Cuba. And of course, that was about the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis and all those different things. That gives you an idea. Operation Northwoods. It's unclassified. You can look it up. It's easily accessible. Another thing, MK Ultra. Again, this is something that's not a secret. Now, we also talked about MK Ultra on that episode. It was a mind control program by the United States government that involved a lot of drugs and torture and a lot of messed up stuff spread out over a lot of universities and other facilities across the country to try and develop mind control. And this was back in, I believe, the 50s and 60s. It was like earlier in the Cold War. They believe the Russians had been developing the technology, basically trying to destroy all the evidence. They were destroying all the files on MK Ultra that they had. Whoever it was, that was what was going on. And it turns out there were some files that were misfiled, so they were missed in the document purging. And it still had a lot of information, but it was only a fraction of what was actually going on with MK Ultra. But then it was declassified in, I think, the 90s that, yes, this was going on, and the documents that were salvaged were declassified. And we know about it. Again, we would have never even known about it, especially with any kind of documentation, because the government tried to cover up their tracks. You remember the Benghazi cover-up? Tried to make it look like it was over a TV show, I think, that came out, or commercial. That these Americans got killed, and then also how soldiers at the base that was like an hour away were being told to stand down. And if you've seen the movie 13 Hours or read the book about them going and rescuing these guys and rescuing who they could, and a lot more people would have died if it wasn't for these special forces that disobeyed orders. I believe they were special forces. to rescue these guys at Benghazi, and the whole thing where the ambassador had been requesting increased security for a long time, and the Clinton, who was Secretary of State at the time, Hillary Clinton, was ignoring it. All those different things. Just kind of a brief refresher there on some of the key points. You remember that? And how they completely changed what it was supposed to be about for a long, long time, and finally they were forced to admit, yes, this is what was going on. Or how about the Epstein fiasco? This is perhaps a smaller, more specific example, but all of a sudden this guy that's supposed to have information on and dirt on all these people, and at least some politicians were implicated about this pedophile ring that he had going on, and Epstein Island and all that different stuff. And then what happened? He winds up dead in his cell, and he's supposed to be under 24-hour surveillance watch, and these two guards magically went on break or whatever it was. And then finally the coroner's report came out, and the coroner said no, he didn't kill himself. Just like, and kind of the running joke, Epstein didn't kill himself. But the coroner came out and said no, he didn't kill himself. He was hung, or at least his neck was broken in a way he couldn't have killed himself. And how that basically was just ignored when that happened. It's just a few examples, right? And then one other point, we need to realize that even most of the problems in the government, and I'm not talking about the problems the government tries to solve, like, oh, we need equity, or we need affirmative action, whatever that stuff is, which is a separate discussion to some degree. But the kind of the problems in the government that the government may talk about and even pretend to address are part of the corrupt and putrid system now. I've kind of alluded to. When you think about the gridlock in Washington, politicians love to talk about the gridlock, and we're all gridlocked because of this or because of that. How about the crazy, insane spending, right? Oh, we just passed another trillion-dollar budget with all this trash in it that doesn't need to be in there, and provides funding for all sorts of other stuff. And we probably snuck some other things in on the tail end of the bill too. And it's 4,000 pages long, and nobody's ever read it. Or even, and this is kind of a separate issue, but the destruction of social programs like Social Security. Oh, Social Security's bankrupt, right? We need to fix this and all that kind of stuff. They don't do anything about it. They always talk about it, and they use it to further their political schemes. It's part of the political game at this point. They talk about these problems. They talk about fixing these problems, and the opposition party people, the Republicans and Democrats, go after each other all on TV so people see it. And then they never do anything. And why do they do that? Because it gets them reelected. Because that gives them the thing to run on. Oh, well, the Republicans, we're going to fix the problem this time, and then they never do, but people are concerned about it, and the only people saying they're going to stop it are still the Republicans, so we'll fix it this time, and it never happens. It's just a political game, and people need to realize that. Change is not going to come from the way things already were, because it's too corrupt, it's too politicized, it's broken, fundamentally broken and mortally injured. And there's no recovering it the way it is, right? We need to elect people that aren't in Washington, don't have connections with Washington, and do it en masse. Because sometimes we'll get somebody like that in there, and then it's one guy, and they do a hit piece on him, and the pressure builds on him, and he has no real comrades, and he ends up breaking eventually, or getting out of Congress altogether. So it needs to be more than just one or two guys every time an election comes up. It needs to be multiple people at once so they can actually form a contingent of people that aren't in this corrupt establishment. That's just one example of how to fix it. But it is really that bad. Even the problems are part of the political game. They're part of the disease, and there's no extracting that. It's like a rotten house or a house with black mold. You have to cut that part out, or tear the house down completely to deal with the black mold. There's no cleaning it and it's all good. There's no scrubbing. All you're doing is taking the surface stuff off, and it's not going to fix the problem, and it's just going to get worse. It's kind of like, it's also, if you want to think of this illustration, it's like a leaky faucet, and what we always try and do is we try and mop up the water, but we never fix the pipe. So guess what? We just keep mopping up water. Well, if we had a leaky pipe in real life, we're going to fix the leaky pipe and then mop up the water. And that's the problem. The government is the leaky pipe at this point, right? We have to fix that fundamentally, not elect another Republican. That's not going to be a necessary fix, especially, like I said, if they have any kind of establishment connections. And there's a lot of other potential solutions and that sort of stuff. We're not getting into that too much right now. We've already gone a little long already. But this is just a sample of some of the horrendous things that are happening. And they've been happening for decades in most cases. And I would ask you the question, too, all this stuff that we do know, what don't we know? Because we all know the government's super secretive and there's a lot of stuff they don't tell people. What is still hidden? That's a really good question, and one that I both want to answer and I kind of dread being answered, right? Because it could be pretty bad. It is pretty bad. I know that, because what we do know already is pretty bad. But it's all the more reason to be active. We must work or support those who work to fix these problems. And there are solutions. Like I said, mention a couple options. But it's a cultural, fundamental issue, and we have to fix it by addressing cultural, fundamental issues. And that's very general, I know, but it gives you an excuse to justify, helping me because I'm trying to fix cultural fundamental issues. little self-promotion there, just saying. Anyway, jokes aside, I hope that you've come away from this episode a little better than when you started it. Don't forget all the different ways to support the Kentuckian. There are many. Don't forget our merchandise. Remember that liking, subscribing, hitting the Rumble button if you're watching on Rumble, all those sorts of things really do help a lot. They do make a difference, so thank you for that if you do that. And don't forget the Patreon if you'd like to get some exclusive benefits that only our patrons have access to, and you can interact with me a bit more directly. And if that's something you're interested in, be sure to check that out. Check out our social media, all those things. You know the drill. I do need to make sure I mention it, but for those of you that have been listening, you do kind of probably know the drill at this point. So anyway, I hope that you all have enjoyed this episode. I hope you've gained something from it. And remember, friends, as long as you and I are doing what's right, we'll make a real difference in this old world. This has been Ryan Dalton of the Kentuckian, signing off.